You are listening to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review at tnsr.org. This is the second part of our extended conversation about the legacy of the late Robert Jervis. Bob was a titan of international relations and changed the lives of so many, and his intellectual contributions have changed the way so many of us think about the world, whether we understand it or not. I highly recommend listening to the first part of this episode before proceeding with this one, but it is a continuation of the same conversation with Frank Gavin, Mira Rapp-Hooper, Colin Call, and Derek Chalet. Enjoy.
Henry Kissinger famously said that you go into government and you basically use the intellectual resources that you developed over time, and then it sort of goes down and
deplete your intellectual capital over time.
Deplete your intellectual capital. There's some funny stories to be told about Bob and Dr. Kissinger that we could get into, but I guess what I'm interested in, there's a couple aspects of this. Is one, if that is true, this Jervisian intellectual capital that you've all been given seems both unique and important. And it would be interesting, and I think important, to say, how do we replicate it, right? Two, I wonder, I keep thinking, listening to you guys talk, I keep having this image of what would Bob be like in government, right? Which, brings up some hilarious images. But I wonder if Henry was actually right. And in fact, if because of this Jervisian way, you guys have actually, if you're constantly learning and adding to your capital, or is that depletion happening? So I guess sort of 2 points: how to replicate this particular set of intellectual capital that seems unique and obviously important and incredibly relevant, but also rare. Then also, are you adding to this Jervisian learning while you're actually doing?
I mean, I will just say, Kissinger is a brilliant guy who's said a lot of things that I think make a lot of sense. I've always thought that statement was backwards. Clearly the background that we all had in academia has informed how we've, performed in our jobs and engaged in the policy world. But as someone, I guess unique among the three of us, of kind of going back and forth, right? So, in the academy for a few years, then then into government, and then back in the academy, I always find that there's kind of a dialectic between the two, that I build up intellectual capital. I'm working on something. It informs what I do in the policy world, but I'm exposed to so much more information. Having a clearance makes a difference in terms of how you see certain aspects of the world. That then informs the next chapter of the academic work, and you go back in government, you kind of repeat. So neither one of it, it's not like a drawing down. It really is a kind of mutually reinforcing aspect. That though requires that you don't hold on to one set of ideas that you had, and you aren't willing to adjust your perspective. And one of the things that we've talked about here with Bob is that he didn't cling to his own ideas. In fact, he oftentimes thrilled in a student or a colleague changing his mind or proving that he was wrong. And so there is no necessary trade-off between what you learn in the academy and then spending it down in government, so long as you're willing to learn and adapt your ideas. And I think that was something that was very much in Bob's, the spirit of Bob's ideas.
Yeah, and I totally agree with Colin. I mean, I've been in and out of government 4 times over my career, and when I've been out of government, I've been in think tanks. So I've sort of lived the life of a pseudo-academic. And I've found that I have learned so much in government. The challenge is the inputs are so intense when you're working in government, and they've only gotten more intense as my career's advanced. You just don't have time to reflect on it and think deeply about it, because you just don't have time. I mean, basically, your mind is going all day, and then you get 6 hours sleep at night at best, and then you're off to the next day, right? So when I've left government, I've found, particularly in those first few years, a kind of the detox period where I really have realized how much I have learned in government. So I think there's something to what Kissinger said, and that you're just going so fast that you feel like it's hard to fully understand all the new things that you're learning. But that experience, it's unlike anything I can think of in terms of filling the intellectual reservoir. The just reflecting back on kind of also this idea that those who have it all figured out, believe me, we know plenty of those folks in government, and our history is littered with examples of people who came into government thinking they had it all figured out and they knew how the world worked. And some of those people reached positions of very high power and influence. And some of our greatest mistakes as a country are driven from those kinds of decisions. So, I mean, oftentimes those are the people who get the most attention, either in academia or in the press or in our political system. But I'd like to think, and this is, certainly a self-serving point, that the kind of Jervisian way of endless curiosity, of humility, of open-mindedness, of a doggedness to try to get that right answer and be willing to take information from any corner to get that right answer is ultimately going to make better policy decisions than someone who comes in with an overly simplistic view of the world who thinks they've got it all figured out.
I was just going to chime in, Frank. I couldn't agree more with both of what Derek and Colin said. I was going to chime in on your question about, sort of what Bob would have been like in government. I don't think he would have touched that with a 10-foot pole. I do think he had a very formative experience early in his career. Right after, as he was finishing up graduate school, he did an internship in the intelligence community that really sort of left a mark on him. And it really drove his continued passion for questions related to human psychology. And obviously his work in the logic of images and perception and misperception all reflect that beautifully. And he remained deeply connected to the intelligence community for the rest of his life. But there are, number one, I would say any number of things about government that would have been completely maddening to him and that he would not have tolerated for more than a few days. Just the unbelievably sort of glacial pace of the bureaucracy, or the difficulty of changing course sometimes, as well as just sort of any number of constraints that pop up on decision making that can be really, really difficult.
The dress code alone probably would have thrown him.
Indeed. But I also think that sort of the nature of his mind was that he needed and made full use of the freedom that he had, right? To sort of build these theories, pepper them with anecdotal observations, and follow them through to their conclusion. And that he was really at his best doing exactly what he was doing. But one of the more interesting conversations I ever had with him was the last time I saw him, which was about a week before he died. I went home to New York for Thanksgiving and I went by to visit. I knew he was not well, and I thought I would be there for just a short time, thinking that he might not be up for more than a short visit. But it kind of turned into a typical visit to Jervis's office, where all of a sudden you tumble down the rabbit hole and you lose track of time because you're having so much fun and everything's so interesting. And in his sort of questioning of me and how my time in government was unfolding, I brought up the fact of management and what someone was like as a manager being really important, and held up a few instances in which I could point to direct foreign policy outcomes in which something had either gone better or more poorly than it should have because of someone being a really good manager. And you could see, despite the fact that he was tired, that, this is not an easy period for him by any means, that he kind of sprung to life on the idea of thinking of management as a new variable that he hadn't accounted for yet. And so he started just peppering me with questions about what makes a good manager. Can you give me examples of this type of good manager, that type of bad manager? Then he started interrogating his wife for types of managers that she had been around, his amazing wife, Kathy. And you could see that he just sort of become reawakened by there being another force in government and decision-making that he hadn't fully turned over. And again, this was just days before the end of his life. So that, I think, endless fascination with the work of policymaking and decision-making in all of its forms and with all of the possible variables truly was with him to the last.
I think what would have driven him crazy. It's such a good story, by the way. The only job I could think in government that it would maybe be like the head of the NIC,
right?
The National Intelligence Council, where like if his entire job was to provide, kind of broad analytic judgments on sweeping trends and things that happen, and he would have been really good at trying to filter through the biases he knew from the intelligence community, et cetera. But what would have driven him absolutely crazy is having to toe like a corporate position. And by corporate, I mean like all of us when we serve in government, there's a certain that we all have our individual views. We fight hard for those views. We push, we jostle, whatever. But at a certain point, someone more senior than us makes a decision, and then you have to execute. And even if you don't agree with that decision, I mean, presuming that it's legal and ethical and all of the rest, like, you salute smartly and you move out and you defend it, and you defend it in the interagency, you defend it in public, and that's your job. It would have been hard to see Bob doing that because at the end of the day, he was such an individual and wanted to constantly being, to what he was saying, what he was writing was based on how he was seeing things and interrogating things, and he would be open to change. But he was not the kind of guy who I think would toe the party line.
Right.
So both of the image I had when Mira was telling her story was of Dumbledore, that he would be, if government had like a sort of a head of Hogwarts that was running the government, that I could see Bob doing that with the wizard hat, but short of that, I couldn't see. The idea of him being managed or managing anyone is hilarious.
As Colin was just speaking, I had the image of Bob on a deputies committee meeting,
right?
In one of the Hollywood squares, and that was terrifying.
It's hard to see him in the bureaucratic trenches. That said, he was very engaged with government. I think, Frank, you mentioned this a while ago. One of the most formative experiences professionally for him was his work in the late 1970s, where he was brought in by the intelligence community to help them try to understand their failure to see the overthrow of the Shah. And that there was a classified study that he had done that was, when I was in graduate school, Colin and I were in graduate school, was kind of legendary but it was still classified. So no one had seen it. And then it was since declassified. And that was the first part of his book on intelligence. The second part was this article, or based on the article that Mira mentioned, on Iraq. And then throughout his career, for probably most of his career, certainly the time that I knew him, he was always on some government outside committee. There was a declassification committee or a historians committee, long association with the CIA, State Department Historical Advisory Committee. So was able to kind of lend his knowledge in that kind of indirect way in government. So although he never, other than maybe this internship, served in the trenches, he always was able to contribute. I think it's a good model for other scholars to make. And Frank, it's one that you followed yourself.
It's something interesting. I 100% agree. His CV was like the longest CV of all time.
Right.
I mean, like the number of articles that he wrote, I don't even know how it was humanly possible. But what's also so fascinating is he wrote countless other things that nobody ever saw,
right,
or few people saw. So whether it's a classified review of the Iran or Iraq intelligence, or also just a think piece, a think paper that he wrote for some conference or other things. He was just constantly churning out ideas. And what he wanted is his ideas to matter, but not like, so it's crazy.
Yes.
The one thing, all these great Jervisian qualities that you all have mentioned so eloquently, the sort of incredibly well-read, the generosity, the curiosity, the willingness to be told you were wrong, or at least to challenge your own ideas. One thing is that, and it's a shame we don't have them here, but he also produced Republican policymakers. Someone mentioned earlier, Tom Christensen and Victor Cha, and which is kind of unique, right? And I know all three of you have
and folks like Dennis who've worked for both.
Right.
I mean, I don't know that Victor or Tom would consider them as Republican anymore, but
Well, but let's put it this way: that there's
served in
right,
Republican administrations.
So one of the things I'm thinking about is we live in an era now where what Dennis has done is kind of increasingly inconceivable, right? And so I think there was a long period of sort of the idea that bipartisan foreign policy was a thing, and that there was a certain shared set of ideals, and that people, even though they might have different party affiliations, they could work together, they would occasionally serve. And in our polarized era, that seems to be less and less possible.
Just for the Dennis Ross, he was in the Reagan NSC, non-career person, in the Reagan NSC, ran Bush's foreign policy in 1988, worked for James Baker as policy planning director, then went to the White House in 92 to run Bush's re-elect in 92, but then was kept by Bill Clinton to do Middle East peace. And so that...
And then went back to work for Barack
and then
Obama.
went back to work for Barack Obama. So that's very unusual. I would
Bill
think
Burns now is perhaps the only one left.
but
that's
Bill was
still-
career.
he was
I mean,
career,
there's
right.
I mean, plenty of career folks have done that, but a non-career person to have that kind of trajectory is very unusual.
So I guess what I'm wondering is there anything about that fact that sort of feeds into that kind of Jervisian view, right? That there's something, maybe it's about the nature of foreign policy as an intellectual problem. Maybe it's the nature of partisanship. Maybe the fact that if we had Tom and Victor here, that you know,
yeah, I mean, Bob was not. I mean, he was a liberal. I mean, as you
Right.
pointed out, he was very proud of his role in the free speech movement at Berkeley in the early '60s. He went to Oberlin. He was very proud of his liberalism, but he wasn't ideological or partisan. I mean, I'm quite sure he voted for every Democrat who ran for president, but it didn't really affect his thinking and certainly his relationships as I ever experienced.
And I
them.
think that he, a lot of his students shared his skepticism of kind of firm ideological views. And I think certainly, or maybe especially the students who ended up going into government.
Yeah.
And so I just think that you wouldn't know from the kind of their intellectual pedigree what party they were from. And I think that's it. It's also just the case that, it's not it's an obvious statement. We live in a much more polarized time where, who's a Democrat and who's a Republican, there's an identity marker attached to that on foreign policy issues or other issues that may not have been the case before. I mean, I think everybody we've just described is on foreign policy issues. So put aside where they might be on social or economic issues. On foreign policy issues, everybody we've kind of mentioned is kind of a little right of center or a little left of center,
Exactly.
but pretty in the center.
Right.
Yeah.
The great thing about this conversation is Bob's extraordinary support of all of you going in to do what you've done and the Jervisian temperament that you developed. But of course, not only do we live in a polarized time, we live in a time where certainly in the international relations world, there is a skepticism about the motivations of what you all are doing, right? So you're all part of the so-called blob. And, one of the last things Bob wrote was a review article about some of the writings on this. And I wonder, I'm sure you all had conversations with Bob about this. I know I did. I wonder what your reflections are. I mean, one of the things that's coming out of this conversation is Bob is unique, and I'm trying to get to the bottom of why there aren't more Bob Jervises, or why this Bob Jervis temperament and disposition didn't become more widespread. Because this conversation, while very heartening, is also depressing me, because Bob's not here. You three and many others are carrying the legacy, but the prevailing winds, whether it's political or intellectual, are not Jervisian. And so I guess how do you think about those arguments? You have to think about them personally, right? Mira, eloquently talked about her deciding to go into policy and Bob being so supportive. But of course, in your field, this is not always looked upon as the most noble of decisions. And I wonder how you think about that. You can reference Bob or not, but we are in a time where this is, you're, to put it bluntly, you're all part of the blob.
Yeah. Look, I think a lot of it depends on, debates happen. So within whether, folks, refer to it as the establishment or the blob or whatever. I mean, to use a kind of sports metaphor, there are debates that happen. They just kind of happen between the 40-yard lines, right? But they're real debates, and they are consequential debates. I think the outer edges are not as reflected in what people describe as the establishment or the blob. And I think people can have a debate about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think the previous administration first of all, they had individuals that were all over the place. People who were
well outside the 40.
Right. Yeah. Some people in and some people out or whatever. And there's certainly in the Democratic Party folks like that as well. And I think healthy debate is good for everything. But I actually feel one thing that gives me confidence, it's not so much about the blobber establishment or everything, but more the reference earlier about kind of the nexus between the academy and policymaking world, the kind of bridging the gap conversation. I don't think we've ever been in a position where at least for decades, where there have, there are a lot of IR folks in government right now. I mean, just at the NSC, Mira is at the NSC, Rosh Doshi is at the NSC, Tom Wright is at the NSC. Yep. Gurwitz is at the NSC. Rebecca Lisner is in the vice president's office and was at the NSC. And that's just at the NSC. Over at DOD, there's people like me. Jim Fearon is doing a year over there. Vipin Narang is working over there. Austin Long works on the joint staff. And there are a bunch of people with academic backgrounds: Eli Ratner, Sadath Mohandas, Aaron Simpson, who didn't teach but have PhDs from. And so I actually feel like there is an extraordinary cadre of individuals who straddle both worlds. And that's great, because that means there are mentors to carry on this kind of tradition of, whether it's kind of, policy informed scholarship or scholarly informed policyship, that we have a lot of potential.
But that's absolutely true. But what would your response be to those critics who say the numbers, that's fine, but they're all selling out, right? To the argument that, I mean, again, we can be dismissive of it, but as we're talking about trying to understand the Jervisian way, there's this some of the most prominent people in your field see this as problematic, or, I mean, what would be your response sort of to that debate?
I think often it's the people who think they've got it all figured out that seem to be the most vocal about this. And, again, when folks from Harvard or Princeton or Chicago, wherever you're from, are talking about elite blobs, it's a bit much, right?
And I think this gets back to, sorry to interrupt, Eric, gets back to the point that we've come back to so many times, that Bob was fundamentally skeptical of the idea that anybody would sort of think that they had it figured out, or that any group of people sort of would be thinking any one way. Obviously, he was very astute to the idea of groupthink, but he would have sort of put up his detector quicker than anyone to the idea that the blob, quote unquote, all thought one thing, right? He was keenly aware of the fact that American policymakers over the course of the last several decades have a mix of kind of theories, hypotheses, worldviews that they're drawing upon, that almost nobody fits cleanly into one sort of so-called IR paradigm, and that decisions are in many ways the results of exactly the types of factors that he made a career out of studying.
I mean, this is a little side note. I've always found it somewhat humorous that the person who coined the term the blob, our good friend Ben Rhodes, was serving as the Deputy National Security Advisor in the White House and the closest advisor of the President of the United States. And he was referring to the outside commentariat world who were, all kind of, trying to bully Obama into doing certain things. And that's what he was referring to. So it was a guy actually at the center of power talking about the outside commentariat community.
Right. I guess it's just, you guys are just such wonderful examples of Bob's influence. And I'm just, while Colin is right, many people are going in, is it going to be the case that other senior people at these universities you talked about, who, when they face that moment that Mira faced and eloquently described, their advisor is going to be, what are you doing? Or I don't support you anymore. Or you don't see that as a...
Look, I think it's a larger issue, right? I mean, part of it is our prevailing, like in our political ecosystem, the prevailing trend is against everything that Bob represented and stood for. I mean, he wasn't flashy. He wasn't bombastic. He wasn't showy. He didn't brag. He didn't come up with sort of one or two big ideas and just carry them forward till the end, right? And so, again, going back to what I said earlier, I don't think that kind of thinking, the kind of anti-Jervisian thinking, brings about good outcomes. I think we've got plenty of proof points along those lines. And, one would hope, and certainly this is an example I think all three of us try to carry, is that the Jervisian way ultimately brings about better outcomes.
So just two things. I think because there's kind of different questions swirling around here. If the question is, if you're kind of a young and up and coming academic, do you see a path to contribute to policy, to go into policy and to not be kind of P&G'd from the academy or be able to contribute? Yes. Like there are so many role models right now for people who got their PhDs and went straight into the policy world, who went to a think tank first and then the policy world, who went into a traditional academic job like I did and go into the policy world and came back. There are lots of role models.
Probably more than there's ever been.
And at least in my memory, I never say more than more. There were obviously a lot, in the 60s, for example, maybe. But anyway, for a long time. The other, though, is but to Frank, your point about for the people who are going in, are they somehow selling out? Selling out what? Like some set of, academic credentials? I mean, essentially, we should all want to make the world a better place. And if having academic training and thinking like an academic, especially a Jervisian one, can make the world a better place, shouldn't we want people to serve who can do those things? It seems self-evident. It seems self-evident to me. And I will just say, as we've navigated just in the last couple of years, some of the more challenging foreign policy crises that any administration has had to face in a long time, it is a huge comfort to have such thoughtful individuals around the table, and not all of them have academic pedigrees, and that's not what defines whether they're thoughtful or not. But I think that it would surprise people the degree to which the kind of intellectual rigor, rather than theoretical dogmatism or ideological dogmatism, it really drives discussions around the table on very meaningful things like what we should be doing in Ukraine or how we should be handling things in the Indo-Pacific.
The one question that I had hearing all of you talk, is I'm very concerned now. You're making me realize what a treasure Bob is. Imagine after hearing this, someone comes to you and says, right, we have $1 billion that we're going to create the Bob Jervis School of Curiosity, Humility, and Good Governance, or whatever it would be. I mean, part of me is trying to imagine how Bob would respond to that, given what Derek said about, he's not flashy and things like that. But it is striking that all of these qualities you're talking about, which are so important, they're very unique to Bob in a lot of ways in terms of the training and in terms of the kind of institutional rewards. Let's say you had that opportunity. What would that look like if you were creating the Bob Jervis School of... You were honoring him, but you were also saying, as Derek said, we've seen the anti-Jervisian way. That has not produced good results. We have a sense the Jervisian way actually leads to better outcomes. This is a pretty important insight. How would you, and it doesn't have to be $1 billion school, but how would you capture these kind of great things that Bob provided to all of you, but also maybe make them more part of the institutional fiber of the training of the next generation, of people like you who were going to go into government service, to people who are going to be intellectuals? What would you do? What would that look like?
I think you would, it needs to be somehow much more interdisciplinary than we are typically trained in. And I think that it's hard to imagine it happen, even though Bob was a political scientist of the highest rank and impact. You couldn't do it in a political science department, I don't think. I think it would have to be interdisciplinary in a way that probably can only be replicated at, policy schools currently. I also think it speaks to probably the importance of organizing things around problems rather than disciplines, or challenges rather than disciplines. And I know that there are a number of, institutes and organizations and schools that are standing up around, whether it's climate change or something else. But having faculty and who are not of one particular discipline, and having students be forced to flex across a lot of things. And because a lot of what Bob did, we've kind of intimated it here, but he'd go home and he'd sit in his chair and he'd he'd read like the latest issue of Natural History, right? And then like some idea would pop in his head and he'd bring out his little tape recorder and he'd wander around his apartment on overlooking Central Park, and he'd just talk into and he'd create tapes worth of stuff. And then he'd walk in the morning to the 13th floor of the International Affairs Building, and he'd hand these little tapes. And it was some student's job to
always
basically
an undergrad at the front desk
to just
Poor soul.
transcribe.
I think a sort of cornerstone of every course, every module would be that your research starts with a question. Bob was very vexed by kind of methods, approaches dictating the research process as opposed to the inquiry itself being the thing that you started with. So I think that would be sort of primo in this curriculum.
It's very wise, and a better way of saying that when I said organized around problems rather than disciplines,
Right.
It's really
Right.
organized around questions.
Right.
Is the better way. So I think
Right.
Mary really hit it on the head.
Right. Yeah. And I think a lot of our policy schools probably do this already, where probably not so much on the interdisciplinary piece, but I think that's key. And Bob, I think, took interdisciplinary to new levels, right? Because it wasn't just reading broadly within political science or history, as Colin said. It was biology and philosophy, economics, but also I think having a conveyor or in and out phenomenon, able to have people have those experiences in the real world, but then really urge them to apply those experiences in the world of scholarship, right? I mean, I think going back to what we were saying earlier on the Kissinger comment, taking what you've learned in the policy world and really applying it to the broader world of ideas, I think is something that we have to find ways to continue to replicate.
Well, this is great stuff. And I know you all have your own incredible stories about Bob, his influence, things that affected you, things that you want to let the world know. And it'd be great if we could end up with you telling us a Bob story or something about Bob that we didn't know, or something that you wanted to share with the world. Maybe we can start with you, Derek.
So I think one thing that comes to mind for me, and this is more about how he lived his life, and Colin kind of alluded to it with your comment about how he would spend his evenings. I remember having a lunch with him here in Washington a few years ago. It was before the pandemic, but so 2019, maybe. It was during one of his visits down here. And we were not too far from where we are sitting here. We were at Kramer Books in Washington having lunch. And we were talking about his future. And I asked him the question about retirement. And I said, what are you thinking? I think at the time he was early 80s. And he said to me, well, I thought about it. And I think that if I retired, I would still do about 90% of what I do every day. And so I kind of figured I might as well just do that extra 10% that I don't want to do, which is committee meetings or, I don't know, teaching certain courses or whatever it was, and just get paid a full salary for that. But I thought to myself, that's a great way to live your life. I mean, basically, you're getting paid to do what you want to do. And so the idea of retirement is just giving up that 10% that you don't really want to do. And I thought, what a gift that was to him. And I thought that's a good way to judge how I spend my own time. Now, I love working in government. I can't claim that, I'm going to be able to work in government into my 70s or 80s. But in terms of my own interests and sort of my passions and what I like to spend my spare time thinking about, I feel like I've got it about right. And that's very much, kind of emulating the example that he set.
It's interesting. So the one of the last emails I got from Bob before he passed away, and Derek, I think you may have been on the CC line of this too. So Bob would periodically write to some of us who were in government jobs, and he'd write these memos. I don't know how else to describe them. It was like 2 or 3 page missives. On November 24th, so about 2.5 weeks before he passed away, he wrote this very lucid 3-page paper memo to a number of us on the mounting crisis surrounding Ukraine. And he was really wrestling with, we made reference earlier to, are we in a spiral model world or a deterrence model world? And he was really wrestling with, what is Putin trying to do here by surrounding Ukraine with troops, threatening a war? Did Putin really believe what he's saying, that Ukraine is not a real country, it's part of Russia, that there are these kind of classic imperial ambitions to absorb Ukraine? Does he really think that that's possible? To Jervis, it seemed crazy that Putin could really believe what he's saying, and that it was possible to pull off. Or was he driven by security concerns about Ukraine getting too close to NATO, becoming a member of NATO, or frankly just more NATO presence, involvement in Ukraine, and that it was driven more by fear than by grievance. And you could tell in his writing he was deeply conflicted in it. I think he leaned toward the latter explanation, in large part because I think in his writings, I think he did see the world more through the security dilemma lens than others. I think he did think that countries tended to take risk more because of things they feared rather than things they coveted. But he never ruled out the possibility that that's not the right interpretation, that the right interpretation is actually that Putin did have revisionist imperial ambitions. Of course, Bob passed away before the invasion happened. But what I am 100% confident of is that, given what we know now, where Vladimir Putin has basically said the quiet out loud, that I'm sure he had concerns about NATO, but at the end of the day, this is fundamentally about recreating some version of the Russian Empire and correcting the wrongs of the collapse of the Soviet Union, that Bob would have been the first to say, you know what? I was kind of leaning 55-45 in the other direction, but the weight of the evidence tips me, back. So I have absolute confidence that Bob would have been the first to kind of reassess things based on how things are developed. One of the things that I think we will really miss is, we haven't talked about in this conversation, but among the most influential work that Bob Jervis did was on the nuclear revolution. The illogic of American nuclear policy, the book on the meaning of the nuclear revolution, which was one of his best books. It just happened to be published right at the end of the Cold War, so probably didn't have the influence, But a big part of that was kind of, what does international politics look like under the shadow of nuclear Armageddon? And I think essentially that was a core question during the Cold War. It has not been the core question since the end of the Cold War. But given what's happening in Ukraine, given the massive Chinese nuclear buildup, I think we really actually miss Bob's intellect, his insights, his historical knowledge, because they would have been increasingly relevant to the types of questions that U.S. policymakers have to grapple with right now.
One thing that I saw at a distance that was remarkable, another one of his great students or colleagues, wasn't a student of his, but a colleague, Austin Long, when Austin and Brendan Green wrote this extraordinary book that was targeted right at the nuclear revolution book, and basically said its core premises were wrong. There was not a greater supporter of that project than Bob Jervis, and they know it, and they were incredibly grateful, because they were taking on the biggest idea, the biggest guy, and he could not have been more supportive, which is a real mensch-like.
Amongst the many traits of Bob's that I benefited from was the fact that he was an ardent feminist. He was married to a really extraordinary woman. Kathy has two amazing daughters, really amazing daughters, and was a fierce advocate for and supporter of female students. And many of the most accomplished women in our field were Bob's students. Everyone from Stacey Goddard to Rose McDermott to Karen Yarhi Milo had really close relationships with Bob. And for someone, at the point that I was working with him, he was a relatively older white guy. So for me to wander into his office, really interested in kind of being reprogrammed by his brain, because I'd fallen in love with his work on nuclear weapons and intelligence, and to discover that this man was going to help me navigate this field as a woman because he understood some of the issues that I was facing was a truly remarkable thing. It was probably in my second year of graduate school when he observed that I was starting to take on a bunch of departmental service obligations, sort of jobs that I would get paid for, but that would require a number of hours of work from me to complete on behalf of the department, coordinating seminars, volunteering to help run SWAMOS every year. And he explicitly sort of said to me, it's great that you want to do this stuff, but you are a smart, competent, sort of outgoing woman who's easy to work with. And if you do this ad infinitum, like they will steal your time. You have to protect your ability to do your own work and recognize that this is something that will face you a lot throughout your career. And I was really struck by that in the moment and then forever forward when he continued to sort of prove himself in that regard. And I thought of him especially much. I should note that we are recording this podcast about a day after Roe versus Wade was overturned in a really stunning and horrifying decision that will have an impact on millions of American lives, likely for a very long time to come. And in sort of starting to process it all yesterday, I found amongst the many things I was reaching for, that I really miss Bob. And I have missed him many, many times in the last 6 months since he left us. But the fact that I missed him yesterday and in this context is really just a testament to the enormous person he was.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Horns of a Dilemma podcast. Don't forget to check out what we publish at the Texas National Security Review at tnsr.org.